Good morning. If I can call the Budget and Finance Committee meeting to order, please. Mikey, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Beard. Here. Ms. Duncan is not here. Mr. Franklin. He'll be here. Mr. Hosseini?
Here.
Mr. Hosseini?
Here.
Dr. Marshall?
Here.
Mr. Rood?
Here.
Mr. Tripp?
Here.
Chair Press, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mikey. Good morning. I want to call the meeting to order. In your packet, you've got the committee meeting minutes from our meeting of September 15th, 2010, moved by Governor Tripp. Is there a second? Heard a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Item number 3 on the agenda, university and fees under consideration. I want to be clear what we're doing in this piece this morning. Regulation 7.003, we amended at our last meeting, will be considered for final approval later today by the board. And what that does is it requires each university to let us know which new fees are being considered on their campuses. In your folder, if you'll go into the orange folder, it looks kind of like this. You see an updated page 5 of your board package. It just reflects one additional fee, which is under consideration by the University of South Florida. Now, not all of these fees may come forward by way of proposal in the first set of the processes, but it is just giving us notice of the fees which are being considered by the various universities. It is in your packet, and those are the discussions that are being held on campus. So, with regard to fees under consideration, our next steps, after final approval at the board meeting today, remember we have passed this through our committee, we have noticed it, so we won't be taking any action. This is information only. After final approval at the board meeting today on 7.003, which includes new fees and increases to existing fees, and the changes to 7.001, the block tuition language, staff will send out a formal request to universities to be submitted sometime in January. So after today, staff will send out a request to the universities to make a submission sometime in January. And then, as we discussed at our last meeting, we're going to have a special budget committee meeting at the University of Central Florida on February 9th. President Hitt, thank you for hosting that meeting for us. Given that we have about 8 universities who are looking for additional fees, and we may have some block tuition proposals to consider, I think we should plan for a long day on February 9th. Also in your packet, and I want to draw your attention back to that stapled group of documents there, one of the data points that we had at our June meeting when we were talking about and considering tuition differential was a history of tuition and fees for each of the campuses and each of the universities. And it was a very helpful tool, but I think what we need to do is follow the FAU model and path and ratchet this data point up a bit so that we could start being able to project forward on tuition and fees, so particularly the tuition differential fees. So in the packet, there is a template of what was done at Florida Atlantic University that I think we should ask the universities to look at and submit. Now, many of them do this anyway, which basically does the last 3 years of tuition and fees, and then we'll project out the next 4 years, so that we can get a sense of what they're thinking on tuition increases, differential-wise, and fee increases over the next 4-year period. Of course, we're not going to hold them to this, but it'll at least get us some sense of what is coming down the pike and what the universities are considering for the future. So included in your packet is that template. What I'd like you to do is take a look at that. Universities take a look at that, see if that template is a workable document for you, because we think that'll give us some good insight as we get together to start looking at tuition differential, particularly in fee increases over the next several months. One of the challenges in that template is that there is an assumption for what the state legislature is going to do with tuition that needs to be factored into that form. For purposes of our projections, and I wouldn't mind a conversation about this, albeit a quick one, the question becomes, what should a university assume from the Florida legislature as far as tuition increases when you're doing your budgeting and your planning? it strikes me, at least, that the logical assumption is 0, and then if you think you're going to need up to 15% that year, plug in a 15% number, and then you can scale back and forth. But I think as we're looking out to budgeting, we would want to get a sense of what the universities think they're going to need over the next 4 years. And I think the logical assumption then would be 0 from the state, and then up to 15, and then you can scale back at that point. If you put in less than 15, the presumption would be if the state passes 7, you would pass less than 15. So does that make sense, Chancellor?
Yes, sir. And I just wanted to say regarding the template that you see that the chairman has alluded to, it is by no means meant to be the template. His suggestion that input on refining it is wide open. Some of you do these kinds of things anyway, as he mentioned, and if you have suggestions as to how to make that template better, more relevant, please don't hesitate. We're not here to approve it today, but the idea is working with our staff over time, you and your staff, to try to create the best template possible so that we can plug in the best information possible. So please provide us with any input that you want to on that so we can refine that document.
Great. So if we can, okay. All right, Governor Duncan is on the line, so we are all supposed to lean in and use our mics for the convenience of Ann Duncan. Okay. Sorry, Ann. So, as a result, for the informational purpose of the meeting, this afternoon we're going to be approving final language on the amendments to 7.003, which will be the fee increases, the increases to existing fees, and block tuition regulations. I want to be clear because there's been so much media and so much play around this block tuition. The board is not approving block tuition today. The board is not instituting block tuition across the state of Florida today. The only thing the board is approving today is a process through which universities can request block tuition if they choose to do so. We don't know who will, we don't know if anyone will, but the media has been extraordinary about this block tuition issue when, in fact, the legislature has requested the board to draft regulations for approval if and when those requests come, and that's what we've done. That's what we're approving today. There is no news about block tuition today other than a process will be laid and a path will be in place for universities and their boards of trustees to decide whether or not to implement block tuition and then bring it to the board. So I just wanted to make that clear. We've gotten so many calls and so much attention on this issue and so much misunderstanding about what the actions that the board is taking today. Madam Chair.
Chairman, thank you very much for those comments. And I understand we do have students in the audience who are very interested in this issue. I would ask, before we leave, if you would talk to the Florida Student Association chairman, who's also a member of our board, Governor Gallup Franklin, before he leaves. And if you can voice any concerns that you may have to him, that would be the best avenue to ensure that your voices are heard on this particular issue. So Governor Franklin is here to my left. He's the youngest guy sitting at the table, and he'd be the guy that I would encourage you all to speak to because we're not accepting public comment on that issue today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to point out he's not the youngest looking guy sitting at the table. That honor goes to Governor Stavros. Okay. Any other issues, questions, or concerns with regard to those two? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the agenda to market rate tuition and the proposal that's in front of you. What we have there is a proposed amendment to 7.00. I'm sorry, let me get myself on the right page here. Yeah, 7.001. Thank you, Norm. We've been working on a tuition and fee work group over the last several months. We met again on October 27th to discuss the market tuition rates and how we're going to structure it. I want to quickly thank Provost Glover, Provost Workman, Provost Abel, who served on the task force. Joe Glover in particular has been a hero and champion in lifting on this. Joe, thank you so much for your work and your constant input. The work group on our October 27th conference call reviewed a draft regulation, and we talked about various differences between the regulation that we have put forth between staff and, frankly, the task force and the recommendation from the Council of Academic Vice Presidents, who also met and reviewed this topic. The regulation was ultimately modified based upon our conversation of October 27th. It was sent out to the work task force and committee last week. More review, more comments have come in, and what's before you reflects all of the changes that have been made. Again, I just want to talk about process. What we're going to do is, if we move this regulation, or this proposed regulation forward today and the board concurs, there'll be a 30-day notice period, and we'll consider this as a final adoption at our January board meeting. And again, just the same as with block tuition, this draft regulation only sets up the process through which universities and their boards of trustees and sets up guidelines to submit proposals for market rate tuition. It doesn't authorize market rate tuition. It doesn't create market rate tuition. It doesn't change anything. It simply builds the framework for universities and their respective boards of trustees to come forward to request approval for those processes. So that said, you should have all received a copy of the regulation earlier in the week. There is a copy in your folder. It should be there. And I assume you've all had a chance to review it. I know the task force has. We spent a lot of time on it. Here's the major highlights of what is in this proposal, so you know. As allowed in House Bill 7237, the university or any university can submit a market tuition for graduate level online courses and graduate level courses offered through continuing education. That's what the bill calls for. What we have done is exclude critical needs areas that are identified in our strategic plan. In other words, we've excluded market rate tuition for those courses dealing with certain education, health professionals, and security and emergency services programs from the market rate structure. Universities can, in the event that there is a compelling reason to include those, each university can request from the chancellor a waiver on that exclusion, but at this point we've created a blanket exclusion there on our strategic interest programs. Number three, we're looking at this as a pilot, so we'll be easing our way into this market rate tuition, and we're going to look at it as a pilot for 3 years, and as a result what we've done is cap 5 proposals per year to be submitted in this regulation on the market rate tuition structure. So no more than 5 proposals per university per year over the 3-year period, so that we can get some data, get some assessment on what has happened, how's it working, what is the impact on students, what's the impact on the market, and where we're going. We think that after the end of the 3 years, we'll have a pretty good sense of how this is working and what tweaks need to be done to the program. Number 4, and this one's important, the university cannot take existing state-funded programs and replace them with market tuition programs. This isn't about supplanting programs that are already being offered to our in-state students or students through our state funding and supplanting those with market rate programs. These are an enhancement. We're requesting various enrollment data and information to establish that baseline for monitoring this to make sure we're getting compliance there. And 5th, although we don't really provide restrictive language, we do ask universities that if there's going to be differentiation in market rate tuition and for Florida residents and non-Florida residents, we'd like to see that. There is some desire to have a differentiation there. But we're not requiring anything. We just want to know if universities are doing that, or if they intend to do that. We'll want that to be disclosed to us in that request process. So those are the high points of this proposed regulation or amendment. Is there any discussion on this before we consider it for adoption? Governor Duncan.
Okay. One question that I had was, and I thank the staff and you for working through a lot of the changes from our earlier conversations, but if we have to go through a full regulation change and posting, I guess I'm just wondering, while I agree with the 3-year pilot, do we want to be so strict that it says it's only 5 per academic year? I mean, if we're a year or 2 in this, do we want to leave it up to us to, if we want to open that up a little more in the later years of the program and try it, or do we want to be so explicit that it's 5 per year for 3 years?
Well, I think at least my sense, in the sense of, well, I'll give you my sense. Others on the task force can share as well. I think the 5 per year cap is easily amendable in the future, but I think it gives us the opportunity to conduct a review. Some of our universities have been somewhat aggressive in how many courses they want to include, and I really just want to put a bit of a governor, no pun intended, on the process at the very beginning so we can get a sense of how it's working. I don't think it's too inconvenient in 3 years to review and just pull out that 5 per year cap at that point in time, Ann, but I'm certainly willing to take comment and thoughts.
I guess my only concern or question is 3 years is going to, I mean, the speed at which this part of the world is moving is significant, and while I don't want us to be imprudent and go too fast and jump in with both feet without thinking it through, I guess just, you know, from my perspective, I think it would be great if we could have it to where the board, without having to modify the regulation, if we decide during the 3 years we want to consider more proposals, that we can do that, is my only suggestion. You know, leave it at the 5 cap for right now, but give ourselves the room without having to modify the regulation to increase that if we so chose.
Chancellor?
Governor, yeah, when I met with the presidents last night, one of the things that I had suggested to them is the fact that if after the second year, for example, things seem to be going great, there aren't any problems, the thing is moving along, that we, between the presidents and I, could always come back, take a look at this, and if we felt strongly that the cap was an impediment, that we needed to ask for an expansion of the cap, we could always come to the board and ask for that. The cap, just as you mentioned, provides an opportunity to look at this thing, but at some point forward, our hopes is that this thing is going so smoothly and operating within the bounds of what we've laid out as a board, you and the board, that that may be a possibility. So to Governor Duncan's point, we'll take it 1 year at a time, but there's always the possibility. I know the board wouldn't want to restrain something that appears to be working so well that there's no reason to restrain it any longer, or possibly just expand it. So we figured we'd take it a year at a time and play it that way. And I think that's how a good pilot ought to operate.
Yeah, and it seems that we live in the world of constant amendments, so I don't think that it's too much of a difficult process to re-amend the regulation if that occurs and the presidents are pushing for it. Governor Tripp?
I was kind of the one, I think, that pushed for the cap, and I'm okay with Ann's language if we wanted to amend it to say the board could lift it without having to go back through a whole process. But I am cautious that I'd like to see how it works before we open up the floodgates, make sure we're able to deal with it, make sure, it's working the way we intended. But
Yeah, I think...
I leave it up to you. I think we spent a lot of time on this, and it's not like we didn't have a real deep discussion.
I think the challenge, Norm, would be to put in a cap and then say, but it's not really a cap if the board doesn't want it to be. So I think we have to go back through an amendment process. But again, that is a 2 to 3 month process. It shouldn't be too difficult. We'll see it coming with a lot of the reporting and a lot of the communications back and forth. Governor Hussaini.
Second.
Got a motion from Governor Hussaini, a second from Governor Tripp, to approve the amendment to 7.001. Is there any additional discussion? Governor Duncan, you heard?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was really having a hard time following everybody, but I trust you guys are going down the right path.
It's a safe bet, Governor Duncan. Safe bet. Okay. Seeing no additional discussion, all in favor of the motion to approve the amendment 7.001, at least a notice to amend, which will go before the board this afternoon and then be posted, please say aye. Aye. And opposed.
Aye.
Motion carries. Again, Governor, Provost Glover and the CAVP, thank you so much for your hard work on this. Provost Workman, this was a lot of work involved in this process. Finally, as most of you know, we had hoped for and have scheduled a financial aid workshop today. The calendar got away from us. This is a very busy meeting, and we have been unable to make that work this morning. So we are postponing the financial aid workshop until the January meeting. I know we are moving pretty well and having good success in getting folks at that one. It's going to be very interesting, and I hope you'll keep your powder dry and come to the January meeting so that we'll have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about access to financial aid, challenges our students face, and the real cost, frankly, of attending university. Chancellor?
I know you're getting ready to wrap up, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I did want to let you know that we did, as presidents and chancellor, talk last night, not just about this, but about the regulatory process in following the statutory rewrite that was completed during this last legislative session, and the necessity now to go back and adjust many of our regulations, amend them, or create new regulations, which is now the responsibility of this board. I can't say enough about the work of our staff and the work of the staff members of the universities and the committees. This particular regulation is a very good example of looking at an issue that started and went through a rather long process of discussion, dialogue, amendment, edit, that has gotten down to a point that I think everybody can live with through consensus. And that's an important point, because as I said to the presidents last night, when we talk about a regulation, it is only because of the requirement that the board have one to cover some of these very important issues. But as we've worked on these things, it is my hope that people recognize that what this board has attempted to do in virtually every case that I've seen is to organize the regulation in a way that whenever possible defers to the local boards of trustees and the local universities and only maintains at the Board of Governors level that which is systemic in terms of obligations, requirements, timelines, et cetera. And this was a very good example of that, Mr. Chairman. I think you and the committee should be commended. And again, the hard work of the people who represent the universities, I think, is emblematic of where we're going with all of this and finding that important balance between micromanagement and the work of an appropriate balance of regulatory authority without going too far.
Great. Thank you, Chancellor. Governor Franklin.
Yes, I want to go back to university fees under consideration. Student government at FAMU, you were actually exploring the opportunities and benefits for implementing a new fee to build a new student union. So I want that to reflect in the notes and be noted, because we're looking at opportunities to possibly implement a fee to build a new student union on campus.
Okay, so we'll make sure at least that is added to the chart that was distributed now to be considered if you make that request in January, and I assume President Emmons, you guys can add that onto your request list. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
Anything else for the committee? Madam Chair.
I've just, first I want to thank you for your flexibility in moving the financial aid workshop to the January meeting. And second, I'd like to ask that if any of our universities or presidents or provosts have any ideas or thoughts about items that you would ask us to further consider as a part of our financial aid workshop, I'd please encourage you to share that information with Governor Perez. I know I've had individual meetings with several of you where you've offered different ideas about the status of financial aid on your campus. And I think that if you have charts, ideas, or information that you think would be beneficial to us as we move forward, please take a moment to contact Governor Perez so he can consider whether or not he'd like to add that to our agenda for January.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. If there's nothing else, let me take a minute and also thank staff. Tim did an extraordinary job managing this committee and this process, and there was a lot of drafting, a lot of revisions, a lot of short notices. So, Tim, thank you so much for your service as always. Anything else from the committee? If not, is there a motion to adjourn? So moved and carried. We are adjourned. Governor Martin.